Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Creating a Gender Equitable Workforce in India. What will it take? This webinar is being co-hosted by FSG and Children's Investment Fund Foundation. I'm Sujata Rathi, an Associate Director with FSG. We have a packed 90-minute agenda today, where we have some really interesting discussions lined up for you. We will start by sharing key findings from FSG's research report. Then we have a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Smarinita Shetty, who is the CEO and co-founder of India Development Review. This will give us a chance to learn what different stakeholders are doing to bring more women into the workforce. We'll follow this with an audience Q&A session. And finally, Linda Weissert, who is the head of equity, gender advocacy, and youth partnerships at SIF, will share a global perspective on creating a gender equitable workforce. I'll now share the key findings from FSG's report, Creating a Gender Equitable Workforce in India. What will it take? Let me start with some background information about women's employment in India. In the last 13 years, about 40% of the women who used to work dropped out of the workforce. Today, only 25% of Indian women work. When it comes to women's economic participation, according to the World Economic Forum, India ranks among the bottom 5 out of 146 countries. This is below even Saudi Arabia. We wanted to understand why are so few Indian women in the workforce. Instead of relying only on secondary data, we decided to also hear directly from women. So we interviewed 6,600 women to understand their beliefs, motivations, and preferences towards employment. As we know, in India, family members have a very strong influence on women's employment-related decisions. So we also interviewed about 550 key decision makers to understand their attitudes towards women employment. To identify the key decision maker, we asked the women, whose permission will you have to take for doing a job or business? In addition to the women and key decision makers, we also spoke to companies, ecosystem players like funders and skilling organizations, and experts in the field of female employment to better understand the barriers limiting women's workforce participation. I'll share a brief background of who is this urban women. 83% of women in urban India come from households with low income. By low income, I mean household income below 18,000 rupees a month. More than half of these women have not even completed grade 10. Given the sheer size of this segment, if we want to meaningfully increase women's participation, we need to bring women from low income and low education backgrounds into the workforce. As we go through these findings, please keep in mind that these are specific to urban women from low income background. Why are these women from low income backgrounds not in the workforce? Our research showed that there are barriers on both the demand and supply side of talent. We will be talking about some of these barriers in more detail during the course of this presentation. But the end result is that women are only able to take up jobs when they overcome all of these barriers. And this leaves a very small pool of jobs that they can take up. Let's dig deeper into the society and family related barriers. 84% of the women we spoke to said, I need my family's permission to work. In most cases, this decision maker was a male. For married women, it was usually the husband, and for unmarried women, the father. Interestingly, the attitudes of the key decision makers were progressive in theory, but not in practice. When we asked key decision makers, should women in the society work? The answer was a resounding yes. They felt that it is important for women to be self-reliant. But when we asked these same decision makers, would you want women in your family to work? The response was diametrically opposite. They said, I would prefer if she does not work or works from home because her key role is to manage the household. Not surprisingly, childcare is considered to be the responsibility of women, not just by families, but also by women themselves. So, this was a case for us where women have internalized the expectations of their families. Interestingly, we also found that even though women are aware of daycare services, they don't use them. And the key reason is not affordability, but the belief that it is the job of the mother to care for the child. So, women who want to work face a lot of objections from their families. But despite all these objections, they do want to work. About half of these women are either already working or seeking a job. Women's typical motivations are I want to be financially independent. I want to support my family's expenses. I want to put my children in a good school. To meet these aspirations, women prefer jobs over entrepreneurship. If you think about this woman's journey, when she told her family that she wants to work, her husband or father most likely said no. She then convinced her family to allow her to work. Her mother in law or mother took over some of the domestic responsibilities from her. Now, if at the end of the month she does not take home an assured income, her family is going to tell her, you're not earning enough and you're not completing housework either. You should quit your job and just take care of the house. So it's not a surprise that women prefer a fixed salary and therefore jobs. The good news is that there are such job opportunities in high growth industries like last mile delivery, warehousing, and flexi. And most of these jobs require basic education and minimum on the job training. For example, a warehouse has sorters who sort parcels based on their destination PIN code. Retail sales associates give customers information about different products of the company. These roles don't require much training. These industries employ more than 9 million people today, and only 5% of these are women. Increasing women's participation in these industries can bring 1 million more women into the workforce by 2030. And women want to do these jobs. They are willing to spend 4 hours a day on household chores and then do an 8-hour job. They are confident that they will be able to learn the skills required to do these jobs. In fact, a majority of women even said, I am willing to work at a place where 90% of the employees are male. So why are women not in these jobs? There are 3 key barriers on the company side which are restricting women from entering and staying in these jobs. Over the last 2 years, we have spoken to a large number of managers in last mile, warehousing, and staffing companies. When we ask these managers, why don't you hire women? The first question they ask is, do women even want these roles? They rarely see women in their workplaces, and so they don't even know that this is a role that women want to take up. Once we convince them with our data, their next concern then becomes, does it make financial sense for me to hire women? These managers have never worked with women, so they're not aware that hiring women is actually beneficial for the organization. In fact, they have some preconceived notions, like women will be less efficient than men. This role is too tough for women and they will quit the job within a week. So they are not convinced that they should take the risk of hiring women. Once we convince these managers that women will do the job as well as, if not better than men, their third question then is, okay, how do I do this? These managers have never made dedicated efforts to hire women. So they have questions like, where will I find these female candidates? How do I attract them towards my company, etc. But when companies overcome these barriers and bring women into their workforce, they see a lot of benefits. We worked with a manager in a warehouse company who hired women in his team on a pilot basis. When we interviewed him after 2 months of working with women, he told us, in the last couple of months, I've observed three important changes in my team. One, my recruitment costs have gone down because women stay in the job longer than men. Two, my daily productivity has increased. Women are more efficient, make fewer errors, damage lesser parcels. So I'm pushing out more parcels every day. And number three, the work environment in my team has improved. Women are doing their work sincerely, and seeing them, even the men have become more sincere. So he was convinced that it made business sense to hire women. Unfortunately, these benefits are only known to him and not to the other managers in his own warehouse or to the other warehouses in his organization. Companies need to share these success stories throughout their organizations and give women opportunities so that more and more of their managers can experience these benefits firsthand. For companies that are trying to improve gender equity in their workforces, this is not an easy journey. Think of the last time you tried to build a new habit into your life, a new diet, a new exercise regime, a new hobby. It is natural to fall back on what we are used to, especially when those systems have served us really well in the past. But simple and small changes over a sustained period of time can help build these new habits. Over the last year, we have been working with companies in three industries: last mile, warehousing, and flexi staffing to identify what are these small changes which companies can make. Based on this work, we have now built a roadmap where companies can take small actions over time to become more and more gender equitable. In addition to the companies themselves, the ecosystem will also need to evolve to support women and companies in this journey. Individuals, especially men, could contribute by sharing the mental and physical load of domestic responsibilities. Governments could revisit policies that make it more expensive for companies to hire women. And finally, philanthropies could fund programs that are trying to change mindsets and practices at companies. The current system is an outcome of our collective choices. It has happened by design, sometimes unconscious, and not by chance. So it is upon us, individuals, companies, government, and philanthropy, to make better choices and build a more gender equitable workforce in India. I'll now hand over to Smaranita to conduct our panel discussion so that we can learn what people in different sectors are doing to support a gender equitable workforce in India. I will be happy to answer any questions during the dedicated Q&A time that we have. You can also download our report from the link that's being shared on chat. Smaranita, over to you.
Thanks, Sujata. It was really interesting to hear you, take us through the research. And so it's very clear from the report, and the research that FSG has done, right, that women are ready to work, they want to work. They don't think that marriage, children, or household responsibilities are a deterrent. But the families clearly don't think they should be working, and companies don't seem to want to hire them. So what needs to change? And to help us dig deeper into how the different stakeholders act, whether they're companies, whether they're funders, whether they're organizations working on skilling, or the women themselves, we have a panel of people. These are, men and women who've been deeply immersed in the space, and they've been grappling with the questions that some of this research has thrown up, and they possibly have answers to some of them as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and can I ask the panelists to put on their videos? I think all of them have. And I'll briefly introduce you all just so that you have a sense of the work they do and the issues that they kind of focus on. We have Gayatri Vasudevan, who's the co-founder and executive chairperson of LaborNet. LaborNet is an organization that empowers youth, men and women to earn a decent living or to become profitable micro entrepreneurs. Prior to setting up LabourNet in 2006, she worked with the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization. We also have Anjali, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Zomato. Prior to Zomato, she was Unilever's Global Sustainability Director. And prior to that, she was at KPMG's Climate Advisory Practice. Hi, Gayatri. Hi, Anjali. We have, in addition, we have Manish Mishra. He's the Executive Vice President of Strategy at the NSDC, which is the National Skill Development Corporation. He's the capability building expert and was part of the team that developed the training ecosystem of UIDAI. I always get my the alphabets wrong. That's the entity that built and runs Aadhaar. And then we have two Vandanas here, one from SIF and one from Udayti Foundation. Vandana Bhatnagar is the president at Udayti, which seeks to build the ecosystem for empowering women in India. Prior to this, she was a chief program officer at NSDC, and she also worked at the World Bank. Vandana Berry also worked at the NSDC at some point, but right now she leads the Girl Capital portfolio in India for SIF. And at NSDC, she was responsible for developing several innovative products. And finally, we have Vikram, who along with Sujata and the rest of the team at FSG led this work and research. That's one of some really interesting insights. He's the managing director at FSG, and he's led several projects in understanding the needs of low-income urban customers and in identifying market-based opportunities to improve their lives. Now that I've given you a little bit of sense of their background, I'm going to jump straight in and ask the initial set of questions. I'm sure you guys will have a lot as well, so you can keep them coming in the chat. But Gayatri and Anjali, if I can start with you. Gayatri, you worked with a large spectrum of companies, right? Over the years, and Anjali, you sat inside companies as a sustainability officer. So can both of you tell us a little bit of what is stopping companies from hiring women? Sujata touched a little bit on it, but you all have like a frontline view of this, right? What are the biases you're seeing? What are the barriers you're seeing in companies? And what are you seeing them do to address some of this? Gayatri, should we start with you? Just what is stopping companies?
I think what Sujata said is about right. And I'll first start with our own example. I think when Sujata and Vikram approached us to be part of the collective, our whole thing was we are largely working with manufacturing. And would that be a sector which would be open to hiring women? I think that was the first conversation that we had ourselves, because we do represent other companies. When we do paper time contracts with companies. And what we've seen is that there is a mental bias which is very high. Can women do arduous work? Can women stand for long hours? Without sitting, is that possible to do? These are, I think, the two big concerns there. Issues on mobility itself and security. These are the other two concerns that companies have. And I think one more which is increasingly coming up is wherever there are migrant workforce which has to come in. Then household is being replaced by men. It's not men and women. The feminized industries, it's fine. Regions where feminization is happening on large scale, it's fine. But wherever there are smaller enterprises, migrants coming in, I think women are getting left behind. So I think those would be the top three issues: is mental bias, no previous role models or examples, mobility and security being a very, very important, it's also a bias in a sense. Can you provide it, doesn't come in, how will I solve for it? I can't do it. And it's institutional and structural and societal problems. So it's not a company issue. I'd say these are the main ones which are impairing it.
Yeah, thanks, Gayatri. I'll come to you on like how have some of the companies started to address this, right? Because you'd have seen that as well. But Anjali, if I could, get you to kind of speak a bit about what are you seeing internally? I mean, at Zomato and previously at Unilever as well. What stops companies from hiring women?
Thanks. Well, I think that just to so at Unilever, I was I was closely associated with the program called Ahilya that was trying to get women into sales. We didn't have we had less than 2% at one point of women in sales, and sales is it was a very large workforce. And at Zomato, of course, it's our delivery partners that are the largest sort of source of, they're a huge base of gig workers. We engage with something like on average 350,000 workers every month, between Zomato and now Blinkit. So huge opportunity there. But at the same time, many challenges in trying to feminize that. And I'm not going to talk about in-store workers, but a lot of the in warehouse workers, which are also an important option for low income, low education, low skilled women. But the problems on this front, specifically for delivery partners, is one is there are some real costs. I would divide them into real and perceived, similar to what Gayatri just said. The real costs actually for us are in targeting the right women who want to be a part of this ecosystem. With men, it's relatively easy. You run digital campaigns. I'll just, it costs us about 3,000 rupees to onboard a man. It costs us 10,000 rupees to onboard a woman, just because we have to do that much more marketing. We have to do specialized marketing. Don't forget the distribution of men and women on the internet is so different, right? So your costs go up. And this was a problem we'd even seen while I was at Unilever. Even to get women, attract women to sign up to an online training program, you had to spend that much more money to get this. Marketing and targeting is a real cost. We can't, wish that away. It requires specialized channels, perhaps, to bring those costs down, which is an area of work potentially for those looking to empower women. I think training is a real cost, because we are still trying to figure out, and might be getting into a partnership with the Delhi government around training women to become delivery partners. They should be trained at least to ride a two-wheeler, right? So who's going to pick up that cost is a big question, because I don't think there are enough large-scale training initiatives. I think for the longest time, we were, focused on maybe beauty and tailoring, but what about driving or riding, which is, a huge opportunity today. And I think, within beyond targeting and training, there's also the actual sort of convincing cost, right? And I don't know how to describe that, but you can talk about it as specialized marketing. For instance, I can't show a woman the same ad, not in India. I can't just say you'll earn 35,000 rupees a month, and so come and join us. That is not a good enough argument for women. It has to be a lot more detailed. I have to also simultaneously convince her family, that this is a good option. I mean, we've had to do this across the board. There are so many more members to be convinced, and therefore there are these, additional costs, and it's a lot of bandwidth for companies, I would say, to sit and make two sets of creatives. It's not. So these are real. The perceived side, very much like Gayatri said, I think there's this perception that we have to ensure women's safety and security, and that's going to cost a lot. And I think companies do go a little overboard, especially if they don't know. I think initially we were giving pepper sprays, and we were, we established this very expensive hotline service. And the sad truth is you're not going to be able to maintain those systems. And then, it becomes then an argument for no, we should, no one has ever done a study to see whether all of that actually contributes to better security for women, or do women actually feel safer? Because some of it is about making women feel safer rather than actually solving for incidents of lack of safety and security. I should also add, actually, there's a bias against men, right? For instance, one of the arguments that I've received recently about not having women in stores is what will the male delivery partners who are standing around the store do? Like, will they be comfortable? So I'm like, you must have some faith in the men, right? So there is no faith in men. Absolutely. Men are incapable of controlling themselves and they will become wild beasts if there are women present. So unfortunately, these are also biases that work against hiring of women. So I think that that's an important one. Yeah, and the last is the low perceived gains, because unfortunately the gains from engaging women actually kick in after a period of time. They might, at least in our understanding, like we've had to wait to see who has lasted beyond, say, 50 to 100 deliveries, and a lot of our women do not last that long, right? The nature of work is also very hard, but it's only after that point that you start seeing that, okay, they have lower attrition rates from the workforce, and therefore there's a strong case building up there. But unfortunately, not all companies have the bandwidth to study this as as a long term, so I would just say it's a problem that corporates don't have the not all corporates have the long term perspective to really look at this in 6 month timeframes rather than 1 month timeframes. So I think it's a time frame issue as well. And this is these are my observations. But having said that, I do think there's a lot of, especially with younger companies like Zomato, there's a lot of genuine interest, excitement, passion, and I really do wish and hope that we can channelize that into meaningful programs to increase women's workforce participation.
Yeah, thanks, Anjali. And I think you spoke about some of the things that Zomato's probably tried, right, to kind of do this. Gayatri, can you, before I go to the other panelists, Gayatri, can you speak a little bit about what all the barriers you've seen, whether they're perceived or real, around mobility, security, all of that? What are companies doing to address? Are companies doing anything to address them? And if they are, what are some of the more successful ones?
So I think Anjali and I have spoken on this multiple times. I'll take some of the ones which have worked for us and some which have been more challenging. At manufacturing, we found where there are large number of women, wherever there's a shop floor, like for example, if it's a warehouse, anything where there is a larger number of women, bringing women into the shop floor will be easier. Anything where there are fewer women per store, per whatever unit that you have, whether it's an auto service. Like I can tell you also one which really bombed for us was on the training front, for us training women to be auto service because you're not going to have so many garages, don't have so many personnel, and therefore bringing women in ones and twos don't work. So I think those kinds of things are a little harder to do. So where there is visibility, frontline visibility will be easier. So companies also, I think, are looking at, where can they bring in women faster and where is it slower? And Anjali, sorry, I'm just bringing in some of our conversations where we discussed saying which roles can we bring in and where could we have better wins. So with companies, what we've started doing is to say, okay, there are 10 job roles. Which job roles can there be an easier win? And then take the harder ones afterwards, Don't try and bring it all in some place. The other one, which is a little more tougher, is to bring in housing. As I said today, if you look at if you look at two major employers is in the industrial estates and in the cities. If we're able to bring in large scale housing for women, and today a lot of the delivery companies are also saying we will participate. You can deduct from women's salaries later, but if that provision is there, I think a lot of girls from the rural areas will migrate to urban areas. Of course, that has its own problems, but housing will be an important precursor to bringing women into large organized sector. I think will be important, and many companies have started thinking in those lines, either providing or partnering in order for it to happen. The third is, as I said, in my opinion, like Anjali is saying, I think security is, overblown. it's a patriarchal mindset with saying I have to secure women, I have to keep them safe. It's true, but I think they go overboard with that whole thought process, and we're trying to actually get them out of that, saying it is your responsibility, but that does not mean you cannot hire women. That doesn't have to be there. One major one which companies have started doing is sensitizing their frontline recruiters. Today, many of the recruiters are going in for gender sensitization programs. And I've seen an increase of it in the last, I would say, 1 year as compared to the past. Simply, maybe it's a business requirement, plus wherever they have taken a decision to have a diverse workforce, I think this is coming in as a good policy measure.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gayatri. And I think both of you all touched on something which I'm going to now direct to Vikram, right? Which is saying there are perceptions and mindsets within companies, right? There are belief systems saying that women can do this, can't do this, they need increased security, all of that. And a lot of times when we work, in the sector, in the area of skilling, the focus has always been on like women and families, right? How do we change social norms to get them to work, right? But Vikram, what I want to ask you is how do we get companies to change their attitudes and practices, right? Because you can change one side of the equation, but if you don't change how companies think, act, behave, go out in the world, there's only going to be so much, thing. So what is some of the stuff that you've seen as you've spoken to all these stakeholders, especially companies?
Totally agree. A lot of emphasis has been in getting women to be work ready. And we would like, if possible, to have sort of more emphasis on companies to welcome them. If you just change that sort of a mindset. And in some sense, the answer is, to changing company practices to become more gender equitable is fairly simple. But I would also add to it that it is not easy to do. I think something probably even Sujata touched upon and sort of is being hinted here. It's like a diet plan. Everyone knows that you need to eat more fruits, vegetables, exercise more, sleep more. But can you do this consistently? Can through the ups and downs, through the pressure times, or abhi warehouse mates, the festive season boom and all that, so we don't know and all that. So through that phase, can you sort of do it? Just imagine yourself as a warehouse manager. And I want to just, also be a little empathetic towards these people who actually are in the industry and, realize that this manager has only worked ever with men. Now, suddenly we tell him that the proposition is to hire women. So he starts seeing all the risks in his head. Like, does the woman even want the job? Or will she not prefer to work in the office? And then is she going to be productive? And, more biases like, the people were referring to safety comes in. And, maybe on those one of few weeks or couple of weeks where I need longer working hours, will she be able to come in, etc. But if you are the CEO of this company, which has a lot of warehouses, my suggestion to you is give women a chance. Literally, try karke dekho. Encourage taking the risk of hiring women, and you are going to be positively surprised. So what we have done is we have sort of created a roadmap that minimizes the risk that these companies face, and at the same time helps the companies take those steps in a particular sequence. So if I just build on this sort of example of warehousing, if you start with job roles where you feel the managers are going to have the least resistance. So everybody you speak to, they'll say, sorting or packing the woman acha kar sakti hai. So start with those job roles and then, deploy women there. Of course, there will be learning both for women and the manager. You can sort of intervene by, putting a HR executive, which is a female, so that, the learning gets expedited. Continue supporting the manager in building skills to hire and retain women. And then to some extent, it's also a communication thing, right? Internally, if you can start to communicate success stories that, in this warehouse, they started having more women, accuracy has improved 5%. or some such thing, whatever that is, it will just encourage more people to try and, give them a chance. I think over time, then maybe 6 months later, as the benefits become clear, as sort of you can see productivity going on, the work environment is more professional, kam gali galot chal raha hai. And then suddenly you'll see that, even the men who are out there will start to become much more professional. So the 20% of the women are not just improving their productivity, they're also improving the productivity of the remaining 80% of the men. And over 12 to 18 months, I think, you should start to look at more holistically, are your practices gender equitable? Because now you started seeing the benefits, there is momentum. Like, do we really need all job roles to be 9-hour shifts? Can we not have some 7-hour shifts? Does the sorting role require someone to be 12th pass, or just, getting someone to do a basic reading test is enough? So I think from that perspective, that could become a journey which I feel is more palatable and does not sort of like shock the system from the top, saying, we need to be 10% women or 30% women in 3 months, which is how generally corporates are used to. Recognize that you're trying to shift mindsets. It's a much harder social problem. It will take time, and small steps is the way.
Thanks, Vikram. I'm going to ask Vandana from SIF this, right? He spoke a bit, Vikram spoke about companies changing attitudes, right? And as a funder, you spend a lot of time working with organizations that work on skilling, influencing them, working with them to kind of change norms, both, on the family front as well as women. But is there a role for philanthropy to influence business? Because like Vikram's saying, you are changing mindset. So whether you're changing it at a community, societal level, or you're changing it at a company business level, not much attention is paid to that, right? Is there a role for philanthropy to influence the business side of things?
Yeah, thanks, Samrita, and very interesting discussions and insights coming in from partners. So you're right, regressive social norms are very much part of the problem, for keeping women out of school and out of work. And SIF, as world's largest philanthropy, which focuses specifically in improving children's and adolescents' lives, designed a global strategy of girl capital that is anchored and led out of India. And what we do as part of Girl Capital is to concentrate, layer, and integrate SIF's work to support the current generation of girls in achieving their best possible pathway to adulthood, so that we are able to break the intergenerational issues of child marriage, early pregnancy, and put more women into workforce. And we seek to do it by improving more girls enrolling into secondary education and completing it, ensuring provision of life and technical skill education to women, and also creating pathway for gainful economic participation. So from a girl capital lens, norm change and strategic prioritization of girl is one of the key levers that we as Girl Capital and as SIF will continue to enable for positive outcomes around child marriage, age of first pregnancy, and women at work. However, our evidence review, during designing Girl Capital strategies suggested that there is a complex interplay between norms, interventions designed to change them, and the outcomes of interest. And at times it becomes really difficult to really assess, measure, which makes the whole process more challenging and difficult. So what we've done, or the approach that we've followed so far, is to layer the norm change intervention in all the interventions that we design around education, around school to work transition for women. What we know from our past work is that doing only norm change will not be sufficient unless it is supported or complemented with a ground level intervention, say around education or around skill to work transition for girls. And as you said, it is very important to involve the gatekeepers, the societal gatekeepers, the community, to really, and not only limit the norm change intervention with women or with boys or men, So it has to be a very holistically designed approach that will work, for norm change. Even around the Skill Impact Bond, partnership that we have with NSDC, where we are trying to find out what will work for girls to ensure that they are skilled and are gainfully employed in work. We are supporting a longitudinal assessment to really understand how will skilling or having more women at work will improve their agency, health, and financial autonomy, and what really works, both from the demand and supply side to see more women join workforce. So I think as a philanthropy, we can do a lot, and the Girl Capital is really committed to really understand how and what is to be done to see that more women are at work. Yeah.
Thanks, Vandana. We spoke a lot about like companies, how they are thinking, what the perceptions are, what they should be doing. I'm going to move the conversation slightly different. I'm going to ask you, Vandana, from Udayati. And Anjali touched upon this, right? What are women getting trained in, right? From what the report says, I think around 85% of the women are getting trained in sewing, in henna, in beauty, right? I mean, what women have been getting trained in over the last 20 years, but the jobs are not there, right? If the report throws up opportunities in retail, in warehousing, in packing. So there's a big gap, right, between what women are being trained for and what jobs are available. And, as an ecosystem player, what do you think we should be doing to change this, right? Because this is happening at scale, right? Skilling organizations across the country are doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Marinda. I think it's been really fabulous hearing all these observations from different points of view, and a lot has been, talked about in terms of these norms, which are impacting both from the supply and demand side. So in terms of this, gendering of training and roles, it's really been a reflection of these social norms, which assume that certain kind of jobs are suitable for women and the others are not. So it, I think, was a programming that was reflecting that social norm and bias. I think, sometimes there might be a bit of an overkill about the criticism on this. I think the main thing is whether the women are being connected to an income opportunity or not. That is the first step. And as I think Gayatri and others were saying, that if there is a slightly softer transition that is being made possible, that probably is the way to go, and then enable them to move further up the value chain or to other more complex roles. Having said that, I think what sometimes people might miss is that in the government program, though these roles, which were traditionally women roles, were dominated by women, but in absolute numbers, the second largest number of trainings was done in the role of field technician, computer and peripherals. That was actually the second largest job role in terms of absolute numbers. So, it wasn't as simple a kind of picture as might be perceived. And in certain geographies, sure, there's been an oversaturation of these roles. But in many others, there were women who were enabled to step out of their houses and make that first step. I think what was missed probably or not done adequately was to showcase those successes and, kind of socialize those successes, make them role models so that more people were encouraged to step out and probably tread, boundaries which were not being explored earlier. So I think this whole piece on mentorship, role models, counseling, guidance is something that really is, an area where a lot more needs to happen. Public and private sector programs have traditionally underprovided for this part and haven't really, made adequate funding provision or budgetary provision for that. And some of the better programs, which including the kind of programs that Vandana alluded to, the Impact Bond or in, McKinsey's Generation Program, or under Amber, there was a substantial provision made to ensure that this counseling piece was addressed, and also to involve family members. That's something also which is, missed out, and some of the better programs and training providers do engage family members so that, as the report that FSG shared, they have a huge say in what girls will land up doing, at least in the initial phase before they get empowered. So I think a lot of that needs to be addressed. Plus, I think a lot more contextualization to specific geographies, to specific income segments and education segments. So that would need huge amount of technical capability and support systems that are localized to deliver on this soft component. It's not an easy ask, and that's where I think a lot of the philanthropic organizations can step up and provide that nuancing, and companies also would probably need to do that. But I think this kind of an intervention could reduce some of the costs that Anjali was alluding to, which basically puts the load on companies to do all of this if they want to get women into their workforce. But ideally, it is something that should happen as part of the education and the TVET system. To socialize these jobs and create that awareness about what's possible. The other point I think which I'd like to just mention is the fact that this whole digital wave that's happening is something that really needs to be leveraged to the utmost. The digital divide and access is something which I think is so critical that it is addressed the earliest possible, because information outreach, what again Anjali was talking about, the costs being higher, those come down, and women themselves and families, the norms change with exposure to those information. So the digital piece is important. And in terms of one more part I want to just mention is about the financial, kind of literacy or confidence to engage with money. When we even look at things like small entrepreneurs or borrowing for, various purposes, it's funny, that up to the age of 18, 20, the share of boys and girls who don't have access to financial services is the same. It's about 31%. But right after that, the gap becomes about 7% and more. And it just stays there. And women who come into it also will move towards informal channels rather than formal. That then transitions into reluctance to grow businesses, borrow money, use money effectively for their small, whatever economic activities. So I think that's another piece that is important to be addressed earlier, which could make a difference to some of these norms as well. So I'll just pause there and look forward to hearing more thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Vandana. I think you've covered a wide range of things that different stakeholders can do, right? And what, like you said, are softer transitions. How do you graduate people versus just throwing them at the deep end in a sense? Manish, I'm going to come to you because we've spoken a lot about what companies can do, right, at an individual as well as a collective level. But I think there's a very important role that industry associations play, right, as facilitators, as enablers, as wielders of carrots and sticks in a sense. So what's the role that you think that industry associations plus entities like NSDC, right, where your EVP play to get businesses to employ and retain women? And some of the other panelists have spoken about some of the challenges. But are there incentives that we can think of providing companies that can get them to start moving with a sense of urgency, right? Because it seems like at multiple levels there seem to be barriers, right? Whether it's at the workshop level, at the workflow level, factory level, where the men are not used to working with women, whether it's at the CXO level where you're seeing the costs that balloon as a result of hiring women because you've not done it in the past. But are there incentives to kind of get them to move with a greater sense of urgency?
If you look at the social context, I think I'll start from there because globally, if you look at the data, it says that the domestic unpaid work done by Indian men is 1/10 of the work done by women. And globally, the data is about 1/3. So we know where we are. So in what kind of a social milieu we are living in. So one is this is not going to go away in a hurry. So that will take a lot of time before it changes. A lot of women would actually benefit from accessing training programs because that opens the career pathways for them. But even there, if you look at the training establishment, the way it deals with a woman is very different when it comes to dealing with men. The counselor there at the center would actually tell you that these job roles are more suitable for you as compared to some of the other job roles. And I think the first counseling and the training and the capacity building we need to start with that of the center administrators and people who run the affair of training at the training center. On the job front, I like the way you put it in 3 categories where you work is last mile, warehousing, and flexi staffing. And I was recently at a very a big warehousing company's big box, as they call it. And so what happened was there I saw these in the warehousing company, most of the people that they hire is through temp staffing companies. And the staff, the major recruitment would happen, say, a month and after the big billion day, and about 3 months of staffing, etc. Now they say no matter how much we want to employ women, they are looking for a more, a permanent kind of jobs, and they probably are not very used to this kind of temp staffing, especially in a situation like this. So it becomes far more difficult for us to, and then you're talking about those 3 months when the shop floor is the busiest, right? So there are things that happen, and that is the reason we are not probably very comfortable. So I think there are a lot of work that needs to be done with those employers also, and this enablement, right? So these temp staffing companies also find an easy way to maybe supply more men as compared to women. Also, the barriers that we spoke about, the transport facility, the workplace orientation, the gender responsive way in which women are actually handled is another thing that we need to do a lot of things about. There are a couple of programs of NSDC that have been spoken about, and we are doing one program with the Generation India where the focus is actually on building these kind of capabilities at the training center in order to incorporate, in order to bring in more women and making sure that there's enablement done for them to take up jobs. I think these are some of the things that need to be done. As far as the training numbers are concerned, the largest programs have sufficient number of women coming in and getting trained, but that's not the real story. The real story is as to how many of them actually post-training go on and access the job opportunities. There too, we see a couple of models that are established to train them maybe in a swing operator kind of a role, and then take them into trains to places like Tirupur, etc. So those mass migration of women from, say, a Bihar or a UP or West Bengal is not really going to solve the problem. You need to actually think of this whole training to transition to the employment from a very different lens, and shortcuts won't do. You need to actually have a very serious engagement with the ecosystem to see how you actually need to actually engage the employers in a manner in which they create opportunities for women to participate. As a very interesting project that is going on with the help of NSDC in the state of Bihar is a bag manufacturer has actually come to Bihar, and they have set up shops in 4 districts, and they've engaged about 15,000 odd women. They trained them, and then they have actually put them on job. And these women can simply walk to the work rather than migrating to work for a similar kind of a job to Tirupur. And this is actually turning out to be a hugely successful model. Now they built in the kind of flexibilities that were needed. The training program also, because we are using a Bihar state government training program, we built in flexibilities in terms of attendance, etc. Because it's not possible, especially in case of women, and we realized it very quickly in the program, very early in the program, that 8 hours or 4 hours of training every day is not possible. So you need to be very flexible there. Similarly, on the work they need, the systems have been made such that the flexibility, etc., is allowed. So while government of India, and for that matter, a lot of state governments are spending a lot of money, I think this lens through which we look at women participation in either the training programs or the transition to the work needs to change. And these, they're largely program design issues, and we need to bring it early and a very state-jacketed program like your flagship Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana or any other program would not work. You need to actually make them flexible, make them easy for the women trainees and the women workers to participate in those programs, is what I would like to say.
Thanks, Manish. And I know, there are a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to ask one because it's related to what you're saying, Manish. Kanishk has a question, and he's like, do we see a government playing a role to incentivize companies, right? And you spoke about some of the things, but is there a role that government can play to incentivize organizations to bear some of the short-term costs, some of the costs that Anjali spoke about, sharing the load on maternity leave, rather than leaving it to companies to pay for it entirely, or to getting managers to prioritize productivity? So do you think there's a greater role that companies can play and support companies? Greater role that government can play to support companies?
Government has to be the enabler. And that is the reason I'm saying this whole program designing has got to bring in this. It should be rooted in the reality of the day rather than somebody sitting in a room and stitching together a program. When you design a training program, it has got to have the kind of flexibility that is needed. And for the employers also, it should be easier. It should be the whole enablement that it takes. I mean, the state of Bihar government I talked about, Bihar state government's initiative that I spoke about, they give concessional land and building to these people to operate from. And this 2 or 3 programs of the Bihar state governments were quickly lined up for the training of these women, and a lot of flexibility was brought in. And that kind of enablement actually saw some 15,000 women actually getting enrolled within no time. I think state needs to look at what exactly would work in a certain situation and then design their programs rather than saying that 8 hours is a mandatory thing for any program. And if you don't meet with the, comply with the requirement of 70% attendance on 60 days, you would actually not be able to write the test, etc., and you can't get the certificate. So all these flexibilities in the program design aspects need to be looked into, and I think there's sufficient money. It's just about sitting down and with the stakeholders and then bringing in those design changes in the program that we use for our mass training programs and also the workforce enablement programs.
Thanks. Vikram, I want to ask you one question, but there are lots of Q&As, audience questions, so I'd rather prioritize that. One of the things, and maybe Gayatri, you could speak to this. Priya has a question, which is, what are some of the redundant practices by different stakeholders that need to be eradicated in order to foster a more gender equitable workforce? So are there practices that, we have to stop doing, right? Everybody's talking about what we should do more of, but is there stuff we need to stop doing? And maybe
some of what Manish said was, some of what Manish said was music to the ears. I totally agree, the way in which, from a training perspective, I think there are plenty of redundant practices if we have to encourage. I think one other one which I would really look at is the number of hours, like Vikram said, and even Manish alluded to, was the whole thing of number of hours a person should work. See, in the gig workforce, I think that has been changed with the whole task-based element. But unfortunately, there, because of other reasons, women are not coming in. But in education, in training, in manufacturing, in warehouses, it is the number of hours. And frankly, it is replaceable. One shift moves out, another shift comes, there won't be that much of an issue. Wherever there are masks that are there, I would just add one thing is, I don't know whether it is a redundant thing that we should take off, but I think an important one is to see why are schemes not talking to each other? For example, why is housing never a consideration? If you want to have 50,000 women, where are they going to stay? No industrial estate across India has local workers. It is always 80% migrant workers. That is India for us. That is a reality. In that case, that needs to be addressed. local mobility is very important. When we say people have to walk to work, what is the distance that they have to go? So can we have buses? Can we have bus passes? In Tamil Nadu, for example, people go from district to work, right? They go from one district to another in the garment factories and the leather factories. In industrial estates, can we look at industrial estates being differently designed? I'll give you another example. What is a normal, I go back to this repeatedly because it's top of my mind, is housing has 18 to 50 people in a room. Good ventilation, good rooms. I'm not saying they're bad, but that's not possible for women to stay like that. It's just not possible. Just because of a gender issue, there are other issues. So in that case, how do we look at it? Or there are none, because panchayat lands, industrial estates come up, then panchayat lands have to come up any which way for hostels and PGs. I think one practice which I would say is redundant is people want to interview women face to face. People do Zoom into, I don't know why, but this I see very frequently. They'll say, let them come, then we will talk to them. But male interviews are often done using Zoom today. Even WhatsApp calls I've seen, but I've very, very rarely seen hiring managers say, you know what, let's do a Zoom. They'll say, ladki ko aane do, then we will talk. So that's something which I think can be taken off. See, maternity is something everybody is worried. So they will actually tell you that if she's married, then please don't bring her to the lineup, which is what it's called, right? When they have to choose they'll say, please don't bring married women, get young women. Because married women will have responsibilities, they may have to drop and go. So a lot of these are also perception issues. Whereas if you look at most women who work consistently, often it's after childbirth. It's not it's when they're very young and then when they're a little more settled, but that's not often perceived. So a lot of things are, I think if we can say that there isn't a barrier of that kind, it could help.
Yeah, thanks, Gayatri. We have one more question, which is, what have you seen work for increasing the participation of women in field roles? Do any of the panelists have cases of how this would look like in the financial sector? Vandana, Patnagar, would you like to take that? It's like, how do you increase participation of women in field roles, which I'm guessing is frontline roles, I would imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably something that is, again, got to be more context specific. And the thing is that I think that's a very vital segment that needs to be targeted, because it's a win-win in many ways. Having more women in the field, especially for financial services, is about getting more jobs for women. And secondly, it also empowers the customers who are women to interface with women intermediaries. And provides them confidence. So I think that's something which is, got to be really targeted, and the barriers or the onboarding techniques have to be much more context specific based on what exactly is the challenge there. I can agree with Manisha's point about the local context and the nuancing to that. The thing is that the sectors like insurance, etc., are really keen.
I think we lost Vandana. We'll give her a second to come back. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think go from it. So there, I think there's also another aspect which is there, not necessarily in all field roles, but where there is a bit of a business development and a marketing component, there is also a bit of hesitation in women to take on those kind of roles. Where there is an element which is requiring them to do a bit of marketing and business activity, and that's where I think some amount of further, again, upfront counseling and mentorship is important. These are roles which women probably often shy away from. So that's, I think, one part of it. The mobility piece is another. Safe mobility is, I think, what everybody's talked about, is often really one of the other big challenges.
I think she isn't in our office, and I think that's why she's having internet.
I'll break up. There's a bit of a challenge there. Both a network infrastructure as well as a behavioral intervention is, I think, that's needed to enable more women to step out and do field roles.
Yeah, thanks, Vandana. I think you went in and out, but we did get a lot of what you said. Anjali, if I could ask you this question, that it's around gender bias, and because you spoke about it a little bit, earlier on, right? Would it be useful to have a module on effectively dealing with gender bias at work, either at work or at home, as part of training programs? This may enable women to retain jobs. I think the person is asking about whether for women to kind of be trained on, dealing with gender bias at work. I think we've spoken a lot about what training maybe men need to do or companies need to do, but this is on the women's front themselves.
Yeah, on bias in general, yes, I think, but I'm of the view that both genders need training on bias, men and women. Of course, maybe the fact that women might face certain criticism at home, which men don't face, for just going out there and working, is is something that can be taken up in the course of training. But having said that, it's really critically important to train men in, and with this would hold good for white collar as well as other jobs or even gig work, that it's critical for men to treat women as equals. And I think that so I've been advocate for bias training for both genders. We are trying it out, I have to say, for the white collar workforce, and we'll update you on how that goes. But I wanted to add to Vandana's point on getting women into field roles. Actually, we are hoping at Zomato that electric vehicles, because they offer this bridge between like cycles and motorbikes, or even high-speed scooters. You get today low-speed electric vehicles. We're hoping that electrification of the fleet will also drive more inclusion in terms of getting more women on field. So we're actually contemplating giving our EV partners some targets to onboard women as they join us as logistic partners. And of course, it's not not a huge, it's not something that we can scale very easily given the other constraints on electric vehicles today. But we are really hopeful that that can be one driver. And then I would say removing, I think, as Gayatri also pointed out, I mean, there are some big perceived issues that we really can't solve in the short term. There are lots of small issues that become points of friction. For instance, we found out that female delivery partners aren't sometimes allowed to wear t-shirts. So we give them bibs, but these are like small things that companies can also solve for, that makes a big difference. Even to women feeling more included in that role. So I do think there's a mixture of course, big things and small things that we can use to get more women into field roles, because I do agree that it's incredibly empowering for women themselves, as well as incredibly valuable to see women in public spaces, right? I would love to see equal number of female delivery partners when we see so many delivery partners all the time. So that's I think clearly important.
Yeah, and I think it touches upon something, Vanna said earlier about socializing, those successes, having a lot more women as role models, right? The more you see, the more other women think that, they can do that as well. There's a question, and I think I'm going to direct this to both Vandana, Sif, and Vikram. It's Ananya who says, thanks for the interesting research and discussion. I'm curious if the study looked at the quality of jobs available for women and also looked into the gender pay gap that is often associated with women's labor force participation. So both, quality of jobs as well as the pay gap.
Yeah, so I'll weigh in on Vikram to respond, but yeah, GLOW, as part of GLOW, the idea is to understand both the demand and the supply side barriers, work with companies to try out some solutions. And I think some of those solutions have been spoken by, Anjali and Gayatri as well, and also Vanna and Manish. So we are piloting those solutions, hoping that we will have more women joining, the sectors that we've chosen: last mile warehousing and flexi staffing, hoping to embed those learnings, good practices within those organizations so that they partners can sustain it once Glow is out. And yes, we are looking at wage parity as one of the metric, probably in the near term to long term, as a program outcome. Yes, it is very much important for us to see more women, not only at the entry level in these industry, but also to see that they grow. There is a clear progression pathway that partners are able to build support, in addition to addressing the wage parity, giving wage parity. But yeah, Vikram, you may please add.
Sure. I think in the research itself, we did not sort of look at wage parity, because in some ways this was interviews with women in their homes. So literally we went to 14 cities in 12 states and interviewed 6,600 women about what they were looking for in a job, what decisions they could take, what decisions they could not take, etc. And in that situation, wage parity, I'm not sure these were mostly women from low-income families. So I'm not sure. I mean, at least we did not ask that question, and maybe we should have. But as far as, based on that, what we are doing, absolutely, as Vandana mentioned, it is something we're looking at. We are working with partners, and there are strategies on how, like transparency, etc. Internationally, it's known that helps in sort of getting gender parity paid. And I would say even in promotion, I'll give you one very interesting statistic. Like if there are 4 people that are being considered for a job or considered for a promotion, and if one of them is a woman, then the chances of the woman to get promoted or into the role is negligible. But if you add one more woman to that panel, so if you make it 5 candidates, then somehow the bias corrects. And the bias, like Anjali said, is not just with men, it's also with women. The bias corrects, and then every candidate has a equal 20% chance of getting promoted. So there are things and strategies like that, pay transparency and whatever, which we are working with partners, but it's a journey, and it will take time. I think a lot of people have spoken about how many decades it will take to get gender parity. Again, not that we have research, but I'm just quoting off some of the research that I've read at World Economic Forum, etc. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think time and again, we're coming to the thing that we have to have more women out there, and then it becomes like a virtuous cycle, right? But in the absence of that, it is a vicious cycle. There are several questions. I know that we have 3 minutes left, but I'm going to ask one, which is there any framework you'd suggest institutions use for gender equality? And I don't know who would like to answer that. Is there frameworks that you're seeing? Maybe both the Vandanas or anyone else that you think companies, institutions can use? Yeah.
So, I mean, when we were studying this from all the literature and everything else's perspective, I think the interesting takeaway for us was that the framework is, in my view, it's almost like a barriers framework, wherein on one side of the supply of talent, you have women who are within families and societies, which is also influencing their choices. And the other side, you have companies and you have government and public goods or policy around it, which is influencing. It's only at the intersection of that demand and supply that women are getting into jobs. And I think when you look at each one of them, every one of them does not sound on its own a big barrier. And actually, there was another interesting article called Birdcage. It says that, look, when you're looking at equity or some of these more complex problems, you should think of it as a cage. Even if you take out one, it does not mean that the bird will sort of get free. So you have to think of that. You have to do multiple interventions and slowly sort of peel away at each one of them so that, the system becomes more and more gender equitable. I don't know if that helps in sort of thinking about it, but it is because often, people try to oversimplify it with saying, oh, we'll train the women and they'll get into job. And, frankly, the companies are not even asking in packing and picking roles for trained resources. They're just saying and they're not even looking sometimes for necessary training providers, are looking at flexi staffing companies to work. So that very simple intervention, we'll do this and it'll happen. For equity, my opinion is it does not work. I think it needs a more holistic, Anjali said there are real costs to hiring women. So has somebody done research and published which segments of women would be more amenable for those job roles? Now we know that for men because that's whom we've been working for. But who's going to spend that time and energy doing research and publishing it? So companies find it easier so that the difference goes down from 3,000 to, the current, it's 3,000 for men and 10,000 for women. Why can't it become 3,000 and even 4,500? That itself will encourage Zomato to take a lot more women in, right? So it's a lot of these have to be peeled and looked at systematically. I think, lastly, I would say we're all on this. The current system is an outcome of all our choices. I just feel this is important to realize that whether we like the outcome or not, the system is producing exactly what it's intended to do by all the actors together. So we all have to change, right? How in our own perceptions are we looking at, what position of power we have and what things can we do differently, right? From how, what is expected of my responsibilities at home, what companies do, what government does, and, what sort of public goods can be created, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Vikram. And I think that's a great way to, end it, because I think you clearly said that the responsibility lies everywhere, right? We tend to focus on the women, we tend to focus on training the women, but, there's a role that's to be played at home, at the workplace, at like a senior CXO level, at like a government level. So thank you. Yeah. Before I hand it over to Linda, from SIF, I just want to, there were some points that stood out even for me. I've read the report in detail, I kind of looked at the research, but the things that all of you panelists said were like really interesting and insightful. And I just want to kind of replay some of that just because I found it useful. So thank you all. But, the things that Gayatri said about housing, right? We just think of everything in isolation, but when you think of an ecosystem, you think of all the components that like us, like enablers or like detractors, right? And I think talking about housing in making women, making it work for women, right, in the workforce is important. Things around socializing successes and having role models. Again and again, I think it came up saying that if you get enough women in the workforce, then, it'll take a life of its own. But how do you do that first push? And then how do you kind of incentivize, companies, governments to kind of do not just like policy, because I think a lot of policies exist, but how do you kind of reduce the costs? And I think Anjali touched upon that, right? Like there are real costs. Just because the way the system is structured, the ecosystem is structured, it's easier to go and kind of recruit men. So why take the trouble, right? When there are so many people wanting jobs. Things about, I think Manish, your point about, Indian men do 1/10 of the work versus 1/3. So there's a long way that, and I think all the women or panelists had a big smile on their faces when you gave that data about, 1/10 of the work that Indian men do at home versus, 1/3 globally. So, it starts there. So there's a bunch of things, and I'm just like picking out things that like stood out. But yeah, I think lastly, it's like, how do we make this transition softer, right? How do we make it easier for people to come onto the bandwagon, right? Because if it seems too big a goal or too ambitious a goal, people are going to say, we can't do this. It's just too different, right? But I think each one of you all have suggestions, strategies on doing incremental change. And yeah, even though that takes time, it's still a starting point, right? What are the strategies you employ, both on like normative change, but things that you stop doing in training, things that, different players kind of, do at their end. So thank you all. It was a really, really interesting conversation, even for me personally. So I'd like to thank all of you all, and I'd like to hand over to Linda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, firstly, thank you for inviting me to take part in this important and timely conversation. It's a real privilege to look at these issues with all of the fantastic experts present today. Personally, I've learned a lot, and I leave this discussion incredibly inspired. So yeah, I've been asked to provide brief remarks to close us out and to talk a bit about CIF's broader work on gender equity as well. CIF's approach to gender equity is rooted in a firm belief that our role as philanthropy is to help alleviate the systemic inequalities that allow poverty and hunger, child exploitation, gender discrimination, and climate destruction to persist. And we believe that this is not just the right thing to do, but that it will also make our investments more impactful. And we see gender equity and gender transformation as part of a broader approach to addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion across our organization, our grant making, and our partnerships. As Vandana, my colleague, outlined earlier today, the launch of our global Girl Capital strategy in 2019 and the approval of a specific Girl Capital strategy for Africa earlier this year marked a real cornerstone in CIF's ambition to become a more gender transformative donor. And Girl Capital is really demonstrating the benefits of investing in integrated approaches that center girls' needs and aspirations and put them on a pathway to self-actualization, and also highlights the need and importance of collaborating with governments to support the scale-up of proven models. So from today's discussion and from CIF's own work, I'd like to elevate in particular the emphasis on the systems level change required to ensure true and sustainable progress on gender equity. I'd like to focus on four main aspects that I've heard come out of today's discussion. Firstly, we heard that we must take a holistic, integrated approach to girls' and women's skilling, health, and employment, each of which multiplies the positive impact of the other. And so integration is very much at the heart of our own work, as Vandana outlined earlier, and has also been highlighted by some of the panelists as well. Secondly, we must also be sure to address broader systemic barriers which hold back progress. So for example, we heard about the very entrenched and complex gender norms and biases that can create important social obstacles for girls and young women wanting or being able to access certain kinds of jobs, and the gap that this creates for the type of skilling that is provided and the type of jobs that currently exist for these girls and women. We also heard about the gender digital divide and its implications economically and socially for reaching women and girls. And we heard about the challenge of providing the right infrastructure, including transport and housing, to ensure women from rural areas can take up jobs safely in big cities and companies. So all of these sort of things we discussed led us to really ask ourselves what the critical programmatic interventions are that can drive progress. And we've heard very important and very practical recommendations for this today. Thirdly, we need to engage with girls and young women themselves as the experts of their own lives to inform program design, delivery, and accountability. And the report presented today is a really great example of this. And specifically, I wanted to highlight that we must recognize and address the barriers to participation in program design and delivery for girls and women from marginalized backgrounds, so that we can actually ensure the proposed solutions leave no one behind. And as we heard, these girls and women are often held back due to lack of financial resources, lack of mobility, lack of networking opportunities, etc. And finally, I did want to highlight, we haven't really talked about this today much, but it's something that is absolutely close to our heart, is that we really need to look at ways to embed a gender lens across all sectors. So for example, ecosystem stakeholders need to be bolder about making the investment case for gender transformative programming in the climate sector and supporting girls and young women to successfully transition into so-called green jobs. So in terms of foundations and what we can do, there's a huge array of exciting opportunities for us to support scaled and sustainable solutions for gender equity. CIF's approach generally is that we take risks where the potential payoff is big, that we are not afraid to fail fast, we're able to readjust our approaches quickly and learn from our mistakes. Ultimately, however, long-term sustainable change can only happen in close collaboration with governments, and that's why technical support and evidence to policy and practice approaches are really important components of our work. So to conclude, I wanted to emphasize two things we discussed today. One is that investing in gender equity, whilst it's certainly complex and not always straightforward, in particular when it comes to changing mindsets, will bring about great economic and societal benefits for countries and societies. And the second is that girls and women are the preeminent authorities on their own lives and futures. So they should be involved in decisions concerning their lives and their communities. They should not be treated as passive receivers of funds and interventions, but as experts, leaders, and change makers. And I'd like to finish with a call to action to all of you today is to involve girls and young women in your leadership and decision-making. Invite them onto your boards, invite them to your meetings and panels to share their perspectives, and advocate for them, especially within networks where your organization has power or leverage. And when you are designing governance structures and systems for a project, embedding girl and women-led representation and co-creation to those systems is important. And that's certainly something that we at CIF also take on board. We are no exception. Progress on this is urgent and will not be able to respond adequately to girls' and women's needs until they themselves are able to direct and feed into those responses. Thank you so much.